Mark, you have made many positive cases for the cultural inheritance of Christian civilization. And maybe let's delve into that a little bit more in the context of those who would dismiss it. Let's think about the moral and cultural revolution, as Peter Hitchens would call it, that's taken place since the Second World War, where we now live in an unrecognizable time compared to our forebears. And actually, someone I just interviewed for the second time on the podcast, Ed West, the historian and journalist, he said there's every chance that the generations that have followed from the Second World War onwards, there's more difference between that point and before than there would have been from the pre-Second World War and the medieval times, because of the level of continuity with how we saw the world, and the various customs, rituals, traditions, morals that we held. Obviously, if you're someone who is trying to dismiss that, you're going to probably characterize the world as oppressive, and that this move toward liberty and self-actualization has been much, much better for the human condition than what came before, which was stuffy and oppressive. What would you say to those people? Because you've made the point that you used Matthew Arnold's words, which was that the best that has been thought and said was what came out of Christian civilization. What did you mean by that?
It was, and it was everyone, every major intellectual up to a certain point in the 20th century, every major intellectual that preceded them thought that, or felt, believed what Matthew Arnold said. They believed that you could not have a successful society unless you imbued children, and thus the citizens of those societies, with the cultural inheritance which flowed downstream from Christian thought. We are, the West is Christian. It's as simple as that. You may not like that, but then you're going to spend your life repudiating that notion and saying that that's wrong and that we have to fight against this, and thus you're reaffirming it all the while. I mean, I often love, Nietzsche's or Hegel's observation that you affirm that which you deny. They constantly keep alive the things that they want to destroy by, predicating their identity on opposition to it. So we flow downstream from that great heritage. And even those atheists, a point that Roger used to make consistently, those atheist intellectuals of the 19th century, who didn't go for the theological basis of Christianity, still felt, despite, like John Stuart Mill, for example, still felt, despite the challenges that he was making to the status quo, still felt that you couldn't have a society without the religious and Christian constructs that were in place. Because I even see that Dawkins now is coming around to that view, however belatedly. Because the point is, in order to have a successful society, you have to have people who recognize that we have points in human life that are sacred, that not all can be profane as they would have it today. There are sacred moments such as births and deaths, marriages, lost loves, children growing up, and all the rites of passages that they must undergo. And all of this is celebrated within communities and given a kind of a halo of perfection through the religious norms and institutions that are there. They link us to the past, but not only, they link us to the dead. They link us to the great heroes of the faith who stand before us as role models. We call them saints. They are role models of perfection, moral perfection for us downstream for them, or in those of us who stand in their shadow. So we are linked to the, as Edmund Burke most beautifully put it, society is not a contract between the living only, but a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. So those constructs, those religious and Christian constructs, link us to all of that, which is why when you walk into a church, for example, you're not just walking into a building, you're walking into memory, the living embodiment of memory, memory of the dead, memory of those who stood on those altars before you, who laid down their lives for them. You're bound together to a sacred place, by a sacred place, and in a sacred place. And from that sacred place went forth the generations which preceded you, and to a lesser extent, those who will succeed you today. So the importance of this cannot be underestimated. And anybody who thinks that we can forge forward without looking to this to safeguard society, to usher society forward on its next great movement, is deluded, in my opinion.
That sense of being in a place where others have been before, and you were making allusions to worship, and I suppose in that respect, even as someone who's coming up to my own wedding day next year, it was never in doubt that we would choose the more traditional approach and speak the same words that everyone has done before, and the same vows in the eyes of gods, because that's how it is that you come to do the union of souls and make those commitments. But it's very powerful when you do find yourself in those moments where you realize that it isn't just about you, and many others have gone before you who are no longer here. And you even get that when you that sense when you go into those really ancient places. And one of the first times I had this wave come over me of realizing what you just laid out there, that contract between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born, is I'd gone on it was partly driven by wanting to understand a bit about why England has churches on every street corner, and why we had the morals and the mores we do. And so I went on this ecclesiastical tour. I'd made for myself some of the ruined monasteries. At the time, I wasn't a Christian. I had been a militant atheist of the Dawkinsian type, for sure. And I found myself going around North Yorkshire, and I spent some time in Ampleforth Abbey. That was a pretty revelatory experience, ushered into a mass, and I'll save the rest for another time. But I went to visit this church that had been around since, I think, something like the 400-500s. It was built. Now clearly it was a structure that was built later on, but the foundations were still there, and they built by, or at least they were made famous by Saint Chad. And there was it's in Lastingham in North Yorkshire, and in the cellar, it's still got the same layout as when he was there, and indeed his tomb is in there. And walking in, and again, this is before I'd even really read around all of this stuff, there was just this sense that this was something bigger and deeper than I'd ever get my head around. And I suppose my question to you, Mark, is, you talked about how the West is Christian, whether we like it or not, and we can spend our lives repudiating it. To take Ed West's point further, the break between what came before the Second World War and afterwards is so huge that if someone was cryogenically frozen, as I think he's put it before, and was woken up 70 years later, he would think he was in another country or in another universe, because we have started to invert a lot of the ideals that we had through generations because of Christianity. And you've talked about the culture of death, for example, and I'd suspect if people saw the cultural discourse around abortion and euthanasia or assisted suicide, they would be really shocked. And so my question to you is, in this age of the machine, as many have called it, Scruton, you, Paul Kingsnorth, where we're living in a perpetual present, we're constantly distracted, we're moving around between apps, we're choosing to amuse ourselves to death, which is probably not too hyperbolic, but perhaps it is. do you think it's possible for people to, one, recognize that inheritance, that bond, these deeper things, even to have a sense, those revelatory moments, those transcendental moments, and then beyond that, to even recognize that where we've come from, that it's actually worth preserving? Or do you think we're coming up to a bit of a sliding doors moment where the further we go along this path you've been talking about, this path of repudiation, that we'll lose the ability to do that and to recognize its virtues?
It's very interesting indeed, because Edwest is definitely right. And this is a result of primarily movements in philosophy, I'm ashamed to say, that enshrined all of this kind of professional nonsense through the works of early continental philosophers that were taken up by mainstream media and universities and pushed then as an agenda. But so he's right there, that there is a lingering remnant, as you discovered in your own life, of this in every village, in the West, across the West. No matter how far the repudiation has gone, no matter how intense it is, there is a lingering spirit of it in every village, in every town, in every city. You drive through Paris, for example, and you see the beautiful cathedrals, almost empty, but they stand there as a reminder of who you, as French people, are and were and can be. And then the likes of Notre Dame opens up again, and people find, for one brief instant, they find that spirit welling up in them. It's no longer something distant that stands on the horizon, the cathedral that you pass in the car. Now it's part of who you are again. Now, not to die down in a week or two, as it always does, and then move on to something else in this age of distraction. But nonetheless, it ignites a flame. And when people come to me with stories of despair and how are we going to, when I speak in public, for instance, the first question I'm always asked is, how are we going to reverse the devastation? How can we ever roll back the tyranny of destruction? And what can we do in hand-wringing and all of this? My answer is simple. St. Paul of Tarsus, stood before the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, of all things, with a small motley crew of apostles who carried his cloaks and his sticks and his papyrus around the empire. And he had a word, what he called, he says, we are a remnant who are being slaughtered and battered and bruised and tortured and shipwrecked all day long for the glory of Christ. But we count it all rubbish for just to know him, to know Christ, right? It seemed hopeless, it seemed hopeless. And yet the house churches were there. The Spirit, just like we have now, the Spirit was still there. In every little town he went into, there were Christians. Now, it took 300 years, I'll grant you. But eventually, the walls of Rome fell, and Christianity stepped into the breach. One example. Example two is Roger Scruton's own life. When he went to the Iron Curtain countries in the 1980s to give hope to the hopeless, he went to preach underground seminars, and I use preach purposely because that's what he was doing. He was preaching hope to the enslaved, to the Marxist dystopia, to people like Václav Havel and ordinary people like priests and poets and chimney sweeps, all of whom assembled in these underground seminars. And he went there to teach Aristotle and aesthetics, because that was going to guide them back to the future, as it were. That's what they would embrace when they came from the catacombs and reclaimed their homes, their ancient homelands, which had been destroyed and devastated in the name of some utopian scheme, universalist scheme by the communists. much more devastating than what some would say than we have now, although not as lethal spiritually, in my opinion, because the old structures were still hankered after. The people didn't embrace their enslavement with the euphoric cries such as our own do. But nonetheless, the monolith was there, and I remember at the same time saying, this can never possibly end. This is with us for eternity. He did too. The secret police, as you probably know the story, in the Czech lands of ancient Prague, eventually got a hold of him after he left one of the seminars one evening, threw him down a staircase, beat him up, imprisoned him, exiled him the next day, and marched him across the border at gunpoint and put him on, yes, and I kid you not, the index of undesirable persons, as it was called. He returned 4 years later to a free Czech Republic, ruled by the very same people that were in the underground. So that's what we've got to look forward to. All it takes is for one event, such as the as I was referring earlier on, such as the event in Dublin last year, such as the election of Trump in America, and the rise of ordinary Americans again to reclaim their heritage. All it takes is just, who would have thought at the zenith of Biden's victory back in 2020 that we'd be where we are today? So no, you don't be hopeless. You don't despair. You don't say, oh, it's gone forever. How can we ever get the youth to embrace the fact that they come from somewhere rather than nowhere, and to be citizens, as Scruton used to put it, of somewhere rather than nowhere, our nothingness. You don't ever fall into that despair. You keep living your life as if the whole world shared your values, and because it's so unique these days and so novel, people will look at you and they'll say, hey, I want to be like that. I want to do that type of thing. I want to live that way. And you'll be surprised at how quickly the whole thing could turn around.